Okay, so on Friday I watched the opening ceremony of the Sochi Winter Olympics. And in this video I just want to talk a bit about that and some wider implications of the controversy around these games. And indeed the controversy around a lot of Olympic games. First of all, very specifically, I want to talk about the opening ceremony. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was a spectacular display. You can see where the money went. This was the most expensive Olympics ever, apparently, even surpassing many summer games. 51 billion the Russians are thought to have spent on this. It was a spectacular opening ceremony. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Maybe not as large scale as London or Beijing, but very charming displays going through Russian history. I believe there is some parallels with what we've done in London in terms of a sort of reflection of history, but they went through everything from Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great to the Cold War to World War II before that, and they went through the whole thing, and it was done in a very impressive way. I thought. I especially enjoyed the onion domes being raised up and the whole fairy tale sort of theme. It was very elegant, very beautiful. They had a War and Peace segment. It was a very magnificent opening. Now, on my Facebook profile, I wrote that, and someone said, "Oh, why are you watching the crime games?" And obviously, they were referring to the controversy over LGBT rights. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Unless you've been on the moon, you won't have been able to escape the fact that there has been... Sorry, I'm just getting an incense sick. You won't have been able to escape the fact that there's been controversy over whether or not Russia should be allowed to host the games in light of its record in terms of gay rights and arguably wider human rights. I can understand the controversy because, as I speak, there are gangs going around Russia literally hunting gay men to beat up, possibly worse. And this is a very, very serious issue. It's unquestionable that a very high level of homophobia exists within Russia. However, I think it is somewhat hypocritical for the Americans to take a stance on this, given that I believe it's 18 American states still have very strong anti-gay legislation. So that's a bit hypocritical. The United States is not perfect when it comes to LGBT rights. Maybe President Obama takes a liberal stance on that, but America as a country does not. And it's one of the very few occasions I do agree with Putin. He pointed that out, and he pointed out that it's hypocritical. And on this occasion, I can't disagree. With the sort of coverage we've been seeing, you would think Russia's the world's worst country for gay rights. It really isn't. As far as I know, there isn't even any legislation making homosexuality a crime in Russia. It's not even a crime in itself. Compare that to a lot of African states which carry the death penalty for being gay. Now, realistically, you're not going to get an African country hosting an Olympic Games anytime soon. And presumably, if there was, there would be huge controversy. So I'm not saying that the controversy isn't justified, but I just think it's hypocritical of the United States especially to take a strong stance on this when the US is far from perfect. And, well, that's my view on that. The second point is about politicising the Olympics in general. Now, in every Olympic Games we hear the same thing: oh, this is all about sport, from the IOC chairman, Jacques Roach, or I think he's actually just had a successor. I saw another guy, Thomas Bloch, I think. I don't know, don't quote me on that. But we hear the same thing every time about how the Olympics should be about sport. We hear about the Olympic spirit, sporting endeavour and so on. And certainly a large part of it is about that. But I think it's profoundly naive for anybody to think that there is no politicising of the Olympics. And I believe there always has been. I don't think this is a new phenomenon. Pretty much every Olympic Games has at least some controversy. To quote the most recent Olympics before this in London, there was controversies about people, unemployed people, being exploited as so-called volunteers, working very long hours, and that wasn't covered outside Britain, but there was controversy within Britain about that. There was also controversy about where the money was being spent, although I think that's controversial in every games. In Athens, there was controversy about pollution. Athens is often regarded as the most polluted city in Europe. Beijing, how can I not talk about Beijing? The controversy around that was massive. I would argue it was the most controversial Olympics ever, aside from perhaps the 1936 games. And the reason I say that is if you look at I've covered it many times in my videos, the sort of extreme tension we saw on the torch relay from Beijing. The fact it was unrest in Tibet at the time, China's chronic human rights problems, which arguably have improved since then. One of the conditions for Beijing getting the games would be that the Chinese authorities promised that their human rights record would improve. They promised the IOC that. I still believe they have a long way to go. The persecution of Falun Gong is an abomination, and no excuses are valid for that. But I just want to talk a bit about, talking about controversy, there would be some who would say that why should London host the games after our some would say warmongering foreign policy. Now, I've made my position clear on our foreign policy intervention, but nevertheless, I do accept that other people take a different view, and they have a right to that view, and the controversy would be understandable. So, there's no Olympic Games really that doesn't have some controversy. And then another example, the 1980 Moscow Games, 64 countries led by the US boycotted that because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The 84 Los Angeles Games was a tit-for-tat boycott led by the Soviet Union. So virtually, I can think of very few Olympic Games where there isn't some controversy. So I think it's very naive to think that there isn't some politicising of the Olympics. Another very big factor in the Olympic Games is nationalism. Let's be honest. There is a very strong nationalistic feel about any Olympic Games, especially from the host nation. More often, of course, every host nation tries to be inclusive because they couldn't get away with it if they weren't. So they do try to be friendly to the guests, they try to show that they're welcoming the world. The Chinese did, we British did, and the Russians are doing it now. They want to show, oh look, we're a friendly nation, and so on. But there's nevertheless, the concept of taking part is all that matters is unfortunately lost in the Olympics, because for big countries especially, there is almost hysterical drive to get medals, and if they don't get medals, there's usually a controversy. Now, when I was in China, I remember having a debate with one student who claimed that there was bias in the London Olympics against China, but I pointed out what was China complaining about, because you'd done very well anyway. I think he said something about the flag being at the wrong level, when I think he was pulling things out of a hat, basically. But my point is, there's definitely nationalistic undertones in all Olympic Games. Of course, it's natural. Most people who watch the Olympics want their home country to do well, and I don't deny I want British athletes to do well. I also, though, take a view, I want to see small countries do well that haven't got a medal before. Because if the Olympics is truly about sporting achievement, then I would like to see some of the small countries that never get medals do well. Because I honestly believe it would mean a lot more for them getting a single medal than it would for a big country, and by big I mean in terms of Olympic teams. Britain, China, Russia, America getting a gold. For us that's good. It's like, oh, that's nice, we've got another gold. But for a little country that never gets any medals, that would literally give the whole nation a party atmosphere. So I think that the Olympics can be a positive thing. I think it can be good in terms of human endeavour. And I always enjoy Olympic ceremonies regardless of who's hosting it. I always find I think it's a great example of human creativity. But in terms of the politicising of it, there's definitely a bias from every country in terms of wanting their home side to do well, and I do see it from the BBC. You know, there's always more focus. Not so much in Sochi, they've been pretty fair in Sochi, but in London there was excessive coverage of the British athletes, and in my view not enough of athletes from around the world. Now the reason, I found it actually rather boring after a while if there's just sole focus on our athletes. And that's not because I don't want them to do well, I do, but it just gets rather boring if you're only focusing on one country. Or indeed just on Western countries. There was a lot of focus on the Americans and the Canadians, so I would have frankly liked to see more BBC coverage on Asian and African countries at that time. But anyway, in terms of boycotts, looking back at Beijing, I was one of many who was very angry with some of the things going on in China, and I still stand by my fundamental disgust at some of the human rights violations that do take place in China. But looking back, I'm not 100% sure if a boycott would necessarily help the matter. I'm not convinced that boycotts stop repression, and I think if the intention is to humiliate the host nation, if anything, that's only going to harden their resolve. And then, in the case of Russia, let's say for the sake of argument that the Sochi Games are boycotted completely. I'm pleased to say they haven't been, and I say please because I'm not sure it would help anybody. If anything, then the Russians would just turn round on their LGBT community and say, this is your fault, you caused this, and there'd be an even bigger backlash. Now, there should be pressure put on Russia to improve gay rights. Putin should be, if he means what he says, he claims he's not homophobic, he claims he's got gay friends, etc., then Putin should enact legislation to make attacks on gay people a hate crime. I don't know if such legislation currently exists, but definitely Russia is a dangerous country for gay people to live in. That's a serious problem. And I'm not blaming Putin for that necessarily, but he does have the power to influence legislation, and the Russian Duma does. Secondly, another problem with the Russian attitude is this constant connection of homosexuality to paedophilia. They're two very different things. Homosexuality, by definition, is being sexually attracted to another man or another woman. Paedophilia is an adult who has sexual attraction to a child. There's plenty of heterosexual paedophiles, so that's dangerous. If they're talking about propaganda, that's real dangerous propaganda. To constantly, when they say, if I was a gay person, I would feel very offended by that. Oh, you're welcome at our games, but don't touch the children. So the Russians have to learn that homosexuality and paedophilia are not the same thing. But I think it's wrong to suggest that Russia is the worst country in the world for this. But I would like Putin to... I know he doesn't have absolute power, but he is still a very powerful leader, and I do believe if he wants to show the world that Russia isn't that bad, then he should enact legislation to jail these thugs who are attacking the gay community. But in terms of boycotts, I'm just not convinced that will work. At the time when Beijing was going on, I had very mixed views. There were times I had strong feelings about it, and I thought, yeah, this is how can we let the Chinese get away with this? A boycott would send out a strong message. On the other hand, it could only isolate China more. I'm using China as an example. It would only increase the neo-nationalism in China, and then it would be very hard for Western countries to do trade with China. And whether we like it or not, we do rely on Chinese trade. So boycotts should never be taken lightly in any situation. But that is not to say that there should be a sort of glossing over when human rights issues are at stake. And I do believe it's legitimate for leaders of democratic countries to ask those tough questions from a country where serious human rights violations are taking place. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we are far from perfect. I think there are human rights violations going on in Britain right now in terms of workfare. I think that's an abomination, forcing people to work for no money. So I think I think the Olympic spirit, overall I believe Olympic Games are a good thing, but I can understand why people, there's always controversy. To look at the next one in Rio, A lot of Brazilians are against it being held there because of the problems of crime. Again, understandable. But if I were to say Olympics good or bad, overall I think they're good. So I've come to the end of the bandwidth from this video. Let me know your thoughts. Should we boycott Sochi? Is there hypocrisy here? And well, let me know your thoughts. Thank you.